December 20th, 1944. Luxembourg City. Omar Bradley was not a man given to theatrical gestures. 4 decades of military service had taught him discipline, restraint, and the value of measured responses to crisis. His Missouri roots had instilled a quiet competence that avoided drama. But as he gripped the telephone receiver on that frozen December evening, every instinct of restraint collapsed under the weight of what Eisenhower had just told him. 2 American armies, the first under Courtney Hodges and the 9th under William Simpson, were being transferred to British command. To Montgomery's command. Effective immediately. The Ardennes-Seychelles offensive had created chaos. German panzers had torn through thinly held American lines, creating a massive bulge in the Allied front. Communications were shattered. Command and control had fractured. Eisenhower needed someone to coordinate the northern sector of the German penetration. His choice was Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery. To Eisenhower, the decision was purely tactical. Montgomery commanded British forces in the north. He was available, experienced, and positioned to respond quickly. The crisis demanded immediate action, not careful consideration of national sensitivities. To Bradley, it was betrayal. "By God, Ike, I cannot be responsible to the American people if you do this," Bradley erupted, his voice rising with each word. "I resign." The line went silent for a moment. Then came Eisenhower's response, cold and unyielding. "Brad, not you, am responsible to the American people. Your resignation, therefore, means absolutely nothing." Bradley tried again, his anger giving way to something closer to pleading. He outlined every alternative. British General Harold Alexander could coordinate. Bradley himself could manage from Luxembourg. Any solution would be better than placing American armies under Montgomery's command. Eisenhower remained unmoved. The decision was made. When Bradley finally put down the receiver, his hands were shaking, not from fear of the German offensive, but from rage at what this moment represented. 3 years. 3 years of condescension, credit-grabbing, and public humiliation. 3 years of watching Montgomery treat American generals like promising students rather than combat-proven commanders. 3 years of Montgomery's careful interviews that somehow always emphasized British leadership while American sacrifices disappeared into footnotes. And now this. American armies, built by American industry, manned by American soldiers, commanded by officers who had proven themselves from Africa to France, all placed under the authority of a British field marshal who had spent the entire war acting as though 1776 had never happened. Before we continue, click that subscribe button, like this video, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It brings me great joy knowing that these war stories and lessons get to people all over the world. Your support helps us bring more thrilling war stories, and trust me, you won't want to miss them. Now, let's get back to the story. Bradley sat in the dimming light of his headquarters, staring at maps that showed the German penetration. Outside, American soldiers were dying in frozen foxholes, fighting to hold a line that Hitler had thought broken. And inside the Allied command structure, the coalition was fracturing under pressures that had nothing to do with German steel, and everything to do with British ego. This was not the beginning of American frustration with Montgomery. It was the culmination. The question was how it had come to this. How a general who had saved Britain at El Alamein had become, in American eyes, the greatest threat to Allied unity since the war began. The answer lay 3 years in the past, in the sands of North Africa, where American and British forces first learned they might defeat Hitler together, if they didn't destroy each other first. March 6, 1943, Kasserine Pass, Tunisia. The desert wind carried the acrid smell of burned vehicles and defeat across the Tunisian landscape as Lieutenant General George S. Patton stepped off his plane, arriving to assume command of the battered II Corps. 20 days earlier, The American military had received a brutal education in modern warfare. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's Africa Corps had torn through American positions at Kasserine Pass with methodical savagery. Green American units, confident, well-equipped, but tragically inexperienced, had crumbled under coordinated German armor and infantry attacks. Officers had lost control of their formations. Communications had collapsed. Entire units had retreated in disorder, leaving behind equipment, positions, and something far more valuable: credibility. The defeat had been comprehensive, humiliating, and instructive in ways the Americans would never forget. But what greeted Patton was not merely the aftermath of tactical failure. It was something more corrosive: a British command structure that viewed American forces as fundamentally unfit for serious combat operations. General Sir Harold Alexander, commanding the 18th Army Group overseeing all Allied ground forces in Tunisia, had drafted assessments of American performance that read like indictments. American commanders lacked experience. American troops lacked discipline. American units required extensive British supervision before they could be trusted with significant responsibilities. The report was not entirely unfair. Kasserine had exposed genuine deficiencies in American leadership, tactics, and combined arms coordination. But Alexander's response went beyond corrective criticism. In his operational planning, two corps would be assigned supporting roles while British forces executed the primary attacks. The Americans would provide flank security, draw enemy attention, and perform the unglamorous work of modern warfare, while Montgomery's 8th Army won the glory of breaking through to Tunis. Montgomery, commanding British forces approaching from the east, embodied everything Patton found insufferable about British attitudes. The victor of El Alamein carried himself with the supreme confidence of a man who had reversed Britain's fortunes in the desert. He had driven Rommel across North Africa through methodical, carefully prepared operations that emphasized overwhelming material superiority rather than tactical flair. His soldiers trusted him. His victories were real. His methods were proven. But his manner suggested that he alone understood modern warfare, and that others, particularly Americans, had much to learn. In meetings with American commanders, Montgomery delivered tactical lectures with the patience of a professor addressing remedial students. He explained the importance of preparation, concentration of force, and careful logistics, as though Patton and his staff were encountering these concepts for the first time. He questioned American aggressive instincts, warning against the cowboy mentality that led to casualties without corresponding gains. He advised caution, preparation, and acceptance of British operational guidance until American forces matured. Patton listened with a fixed smile that barely concealed volcanic rage. His diary entries from this period documented British condescension and his determination to prove American worth through aggressive action. He understood immediately what was at stake. This was not merely about defeating Rommel. It was about proving that American arms could stand alongside their British counterparts as equals, not apprentices. When Patton launched his offensive toward El Guettar on March 17th, his orders reflected burning purpose. Officers would lead from the front. American troops would demonstrate the aggressive spirit that had characterized their entry into the First World War. Whatever the cost, two corps would prove it deserved respect. On March 23rd, 50 German tanks emerged from mountain passes in a dawn attack designed to shatter American defenses. What followed shocked the Wehrmacht. American artillery, emplaced with meticulous attention to overlapping fields of fire, unleashed devastating concentrations on advancing armor. Tank destroyers positioned to exploit terrain advantages engaged panzers at ranges that negated German tactical superiority. By day's end, the battlefield was littered with destroyed German vehicles. The 10th Panzer Division had been stopped cold. For the first time, American forces had defeated experienced German armored units in sustained combat. But victory carried a bitter aftertaste. Alexander's headquarters, focused on Montgomery's operations, paid minimal attention to II Corps' success. British staff officers continued issuing detailed instructions to Patton, micromanaging American operations in ways that suggested persistent doubts about American competence. More galling still, when Montgomery finally broke through the Meredith line after initial setbacks, British reporting emphasized Eighth Army's achievement, while II Corps' equally important contributions merited barely a footnote. Patton had won his battle, but he was losing the war for recognition, a war Montgomery seemed determined to wage until the last American grievance. July 10, 1943, Sicily. The invasion of Sicily should have been the moment when American and British forces demonstrated the seamless coordination that would carry them to Berlin. Instead, it became a masterclass in how Montgomery could transform Allied victory into personal resentment. The original invasion plan, drafted by Eisenhower's staff, assigned clear operational zones. Patton's 7th Army would land on the left, driving north and west to secure the island's western half. Montgomery's 8th Army would land on the right, pushing north toward Messina, the strategic prize that controlled the narrow strait to mainland Italy. Both armies would advance on separate axes, avoiding interference while maximizing pressure on Axis forces. Montgomery hated it. In the weeks before the invasion, he lobbied relentlessly for changes. The plan was too dispersed, he argued. Allied forces needed concentration, not dispersion. British troops required the best roads for rapid advance toward Messina. His proposed modifications squeezed American operational space, funneling 7th Army into a supporting role that protected 8th Army's flank, while Montgomery's forces executed the main effort. Alexander, once again serving as ground forces commander, approved Montgomery's changes. Patton received notification of the revised plan with barely concealed fury. His army, outnumbering Montgomery's by a substantial margin, would advance through difficult terrain on secondary roads while British forces used the coastal highway. American divisions would secure Montgomery's left, while 8th Army won the race to Messina. The invasion itself went better than expected. Allied forces established beachheads against disorganized Italian resistance. German units, though competent, were too few to contain the massive Allied landing. But Montgomery's advance immediately bogged down. German paratroopers defending the approaches to Catania, 8th Army's first major objective on the road to Messina, fought with skill and determination. Montgomery's methodical approach, which had served him well in North Africa's open desert, proved poorly suited to Sicily's mountainous terrain and narrow roads. Days passed, then weeks. 8th Army inched forward against stiffening resistance, its momentum dissolving into cautious set-piece attacks. Patton, meanwhile, had made a decision that would define the campaign. If Montgomery wanted the direct route to Messina, fine. Patton would take Palermo first, Sicily's capital and major port, then race along the northern coast road to Messina from the opposite direction. It would be longer, more difficult, and politically risky, but it would be independent. 7th Army tore across western Sicily in a lightning advance that shocked observers. Patton's armor covered over 100 miles in 4 days, seizing Palermo on July 22nd. Then he pivoted east, driving his exhausted divisions toward Messina along Sicily's northern shore. The race was on. Montgomery, realizing Patton's intentions, pushed 8th Army harder. But German defenders, fighting delaying actions through ideal defensive terrain, made every mile costly. British progress remained methodical, careful, slow. On August 17, 1943, lead elements of Patton's 3rd Infantry Division entered Messina, hours before Montgomery's forces arrived from the south. American troops had won the race. The victory should have established American forces as equals in the Allied partnership. Instead, British press coverage framed Sicily as Montgomery's triumph. Headlines praised Eighth Army's drive against fierce resistance, while Patton's longer, faster advance received cursory mention as a supporting operation. Montgomery himself gave interviews emphasizing the challenges his forces had overcome, the tactical sophistication required to defeat German defenses, and the successful completion of Eighth Army's mission. Patton's name barely appeared. American commanders read British newspapers with mounting outrage. Seventh Army had covered more ground, moved faster, and beaten Eighth Army to the objective. Yet somehow, Montgomery emerged as Sicily's hero while American achievements vanished into footnotes. Bradley, serving under Patton as Second Corps commander, watched British reporting with growing bitterness. This was North Africa all over again. Americans doing the fighting, British taking the credit. Montgomery seemed incapable of acknowledging American contributions without framing them as subsidiary to British operations. The pattern was becoming unmistakable and intolerable. Ahead lay Normandy, where the dynamic would reach its breaking point. August 1944. Normandy. By the summer of 1944, the arithmetic of Allied power had shifted decisively. American forces in France now outnumbered British troops by nearly 3-1. American industrial output supplied the majority of tanks, aircraft, and ammunition fueling the campaign. American casualties were mounting at rates that dwarfed British losses. Yet Montgomery still commanded all Allied ground forces in France, and he had no intention of relinquishing the spotlight. The Normandy campaign had begun with promise and descended into frustration. D-Day succeeded brilliantly, but the breakout from the beachhead had devolved into grinding attritional warfare that recalled the worst of the First World War. Montgomery's sector, facing the ancient city of Caen, became a killing ground. British and Canadian forces launched repeated attacks against German panzer divisions, defending terrain that offered every advantage to the defender. Casualties mounted. Progress stalled. Weeks passed with Caen, a D-Day objective, still firmly in German hands. American forces, meanwhile, fought through the nightmare of the bocage, the dense Norman hedgerows that turned every field into a fortress. Bradley's First Army suffered appalling losses, pushing through country that favored defense at every turn. But the Americans kept pushing. Operation Cobra, Bradley's breakout offensive launched on July 25th, finally shattered German defenses. American armor poured through the gap, exploiting with the aggressive tempo that Patton embodied. Third Army swept into Brittany, then pivoted east in a massive envelopment that threatened to trap the entire German Seventh Army. The Falaise Pocket, the encirclement that destroyed German combat power in France, was primarily an American creation. U.S. forces drove the southern arm of the pocket, while British and Canadian forces advanced from the north. American divisions bore the bulk of the fighting. American casualties paid for the victory. Montgomery's response was to claim credit for the entire campaign. In press conferences and official statements, he framed the Normandy breakout as the successful execution of his master plan. The fighting around Caen, he explained, had drawn German armor away from the American sector, deliberately creating conditions for Cobra's success. Everything had unfolded according to his strategic vision. Bradley's breakout? Montgomery had anticipated it. Patton's exploitation? Montgomery had created the opportunity. The destruction of German forces? Montgomery's operational design. American commanders read these pronouncements with volcanic rage. Bradley had conceived and executed Cobra with minimal input from Montgomery's headquarters. The plan's boldness, concentrating overwhelming force on a narrow front to achieve penetration, reflected American aggressive instincts, not Montgomery's methodical approach. Patton's pursuit had been conducted with operational independence that Montgomery had barely influenced. Third Army's stunning advance owed everything to American initiative, and nothing to British guidance. Yet Montgomery's narrative erased American agency entirely. In his telling, British forces had fought the hard battles while American troops exploited opportunities that British sacrifice had created. The campaign became evidence of Montgomery's strategic genius rather than a testament to American blood and steel. The British press amplified Montgomery's version. Headlines praised the field marshal's tactical acumen. Editorials celebrated British steadfastness under pressure. Churchill, desperate to maintain Britain's influence in a coalition increasingly dominated by American power, allowed Montgomery's self-promotion to continue unchecked. American newspapers told a different story, one that emphasized U.S. casualties, U.S. advances, and U.S. victories. But British audiences never saw those accounts. They knew only Montgomery's carefully crafted narrative. Eisenhower found himself mediating between increasingly bitter allies. Bradley, normally diplomatic, privately called Montgomery's claims intolerable. Patton's diary entries devolved into profanity-laced denunciations of British arrogance. The tension reached crisis levels when Montgomery gave a press conference in early August that barely mentioned American contributions. He spoke of "my forces executing my plan to achieve our victory," as though the Americans were minor participants in a fundamentally British operation. Bradley confronted Eisenhower directly. Either Montgomery's authority would be curtailed or the coalition would fracture. On September 1, 1944, Eisenhower formally assumed command of Allied ground forces, relegating Montgomery to command of the British 21st Army Group. Montgomery's response revealed everything about his character. He accepted the change with public grace and private fury. In his mind, political considerations had overridden military logic. The Americans, he believed, were allowing national pride to interfere with proper command relationships. He learned nothing from the episode, and his next operation would prove catastrophic. September 17, 1944, Holland. Montgomery proposed Operation Market Garden with uncharacteristic boldness, a plan so audacious it seemed designed to prove he could match American aggressive spirit. Allied airborne forces would seize a series of bridges across the Netherlands, creating a corridor through German defenses. British XX Corps would then race 64 miles up a single highway, cross the Rhine at Arnhem, and thrust into the industrial heart of Germany. If successful, the war might end by Christmas. Eisenhower, hoping to channel Montgomery's energy into productive offensive action, approved the operation despite logistical concerns. 3 Allied airborne divisions, 2 American, 1 British, would drop behind German lines in the largest airborne operation ever attempted. The American 101st Airborne would secure bridges near Eindhoven. The 82nd Airborne would take the bridge at Nijmegen, and the British 1st Airborne Division, landing deepest behind enemy lines, would capture the bridge at Arnhem, the final objective before the Rhine crossing. The plan required everything to work perfectly. Nothing worked perfectly. The 101st and 82nd Airborne accomplished their objectives with typical American paratrooper tenacity, seizing their bridges against fierce resistance. But XX Corps' advance up the single highway, delayed by German resistance and slowed by the narrow road, failed to maintain the aggressive tempo the operation required. At Arnhem, disaster unfolded. British paratroopers landed directly beside 2 SS Panzer divisions refitting in the area, intelligence that Montgomery's staff had dismissed as unreliable. German forces, far stronger than anticipated, surrounded the lightly armed British paratroopers and systematically destroyed them. For 9 days, the 1st Airborne fought with desperate courage against overwhelming odds. They held the northern end of the Arnhem Bridge, waiting for relief that never came. Sixth Corps, still fighting its way up the narrow corridor, remained miles away. By September 25th, the operation had collapsed. Of the 10,000 British paratroopers dropped at Arnhem, fewer than 2,000 escaped. The rest were killed or captured. American airborne divisions, having accomplished their missions, watched in frustration as British command failures turned tactical success into strategic disaster. The operation had failed comprehensively. The Rhine remained uncrossed. The war would not end by Christmas. Allied offensive momentum had been squandered on a plan that had ignored intelligence, underestimated enemy strength, and relied on assumptions that battlefield reality had demolished. Montgomery's response stunned American commanders. In his post-operation assessment, he declared Market Garden 90% successful. The operation had secured a salient into Holland, he explained. Allied forces had advanced. Objectives had been partially achieved. With better luck and slightly different circumstances, complete success would have been possible. The claim was delusional. American commanders, who had watched two of their finest airborne divisions risk annihilation to accomplish their missions while British command failures doomed the operation, saw Montgomery's assessment as something worse than spin. It was dishonesty wrapped in aristocratic self-regard. Bradley's reaction was blunt. If losing an entire airborne division while failing to achieve your primary objective constitutes 90% success, I'd hate to see what Montgomery considers failure. Patton's response was characteristically profane and unprintable. Even Eisenhower, normally diplomatic to a fault, privately expressed frustration with Montgomery's refusal to acknowledge the operation's fundamental failure. But Montgomery remained unmoved. In his mind, Market Garden had been sound. Execution had fallen short, but the concept remained valid. He had proven British forces could conduct bold operations. The failure resulted from factors beyond his control: weather, enemy strength, insufficient resources. American commanders drew different conclusions. They saw a general so invested in his own reputation that he couldn't acknowledge catastrophic failure. A commander so arrogant that he declared success while British paratroopers' bodies still littered Dutch fields. The breaking point had been reached. Ahead lay the Ardennes, where Montgomery's ego would nearly shatter the alliance itself. December 20th, 1944. The Ardennes. Hitler's winter offensive had achieved complete tactical surprise. 3 German armies, over 200,000 men supported by hundreds of panzers, had smashed through thinly held American lines in the Ardennes forest, creating a bulge 50 miles deep in the Allied front. Communication lines were severed. Command and control had fragmented. American units fought isolated battles against German spearheads driving toward the Meuse River. The situation was chaotic, dangerous, and required immediate coordination of forces north and south of the German penetration. Eisenhower made his decision. Montgomery would take temporary command of all Allied forces north of the Bulge, including the U.S. 1st and 9th Armies. Bradley's furious phone call followed immediately, but the Supreme Commander's logic was militarily sound. Montgomery commanded British forces positioned north of the breakthrough. He was available, experienced, and geographically positioned to coordinate the northern response. The crisis demanded action, not sensitivity to national pride. Montgomery arrived at 1st Army headquarters on December 20th with his characteristic confidence intact. What he found was not the chaos he expected. American commanders, Courtney Hodges of 1st Army, William Simpson of 9th Army, had already begun coordinating defensive positions. U.S. divisions were fighting ferociously, buying time for reinforcements to arrive. The 101st Airborne was holding Bastogne against overwhelming German forces. Patton's 3rd Army was executing an unprecedented 90-degree pivot to strike the German southern flank. Montgomery's contribution was real but limited. He shifted British reserves into blocking positions, coordinated artillery support, and prepared contingency plans for withdrawal if German forces broke through to the Meuse. By late December, the German offensive had stalled. American resistance had been fiercer than Hitler anticipated. Fuel shortages crippled German armor. Allied air power, returning after weather cleared, devastated German supply lines. The crisis was passing. Montgomery had performed competently. Nothing more, nothing less. Then he gave a press conference. On January 7, 1945, Montgomery held a briefing for British and American journalists that would ignite the worst crisis in Anglo-American relations of the entire war. He began by praising American soldiers' fighting spirit, then immediately qualified the compliment. U.S. troops had fought bravely, he explained, but the situation had required British intervention to restore order. When he arrived, he suggested American command had been confused, disorganized, struggling to respond effectively. He described his own actions with characteristic self-regard, how he had tidied up the battlefield, coordinated the defense, and ensured German forces could not exploit their initial success. The implication was unmistakable. British command had saved American forces from the consequences of their own unpreparedness. He spoke of my operations, my decisions, my battlefield management, as though the Americans fighting and dying in frozen Belgian forests were merely pieces on his chessboard. The statement minimized American sacrifice, erased American initiative, and framed British contribution as decisive when it had been marginal. Bradley read the transcript in his headquarters and erupted with rage unlike anything his staff had ever witnessed. The mild-mannered Missourian, who had absorbed 3 years of Montgomery's condescension with gritted-teeth tolerance, finally snapped. Patton's response was more direct. He threatened to resign and publicly denounce Montgomery if Eisenhower didn't act. American newspapers published furious rebuttals. British press doubled down, defending Montgomery and questioning American battlefield competence. The alliance was fracturing in public view. Churchill, recognizing the crisis, forced Montgomery to issue a clarification. The field marshal complied with a statement so grudging and backhanded it satisfied no one. He acknowledged American troops' fighting qualities while carefully avoiding any admission that his original comments had been inappropriate. The damage was irreversible. American commanders had tolerated Montgomery's arrogance when victories could be shared. They had endured his condescension when British contributions justified some measure of pride. But watching him claim credit for an American defensive triumph, fought overwhelmingly by American soldiers, sustained by American resilience, and won through American sacrifice, was intolerable. Bradley would never forgive him. Patton would spend the rest of the war ensuring Third Army operated as far from British command as geography permitted. Even Eisenhower, whose diplomatic patience seemed inexhaustible, privately began planning for Montgomery's removal from any position of authority over American forces. The coalition had survived, barely, but Montgomery's reputation among American commanders was destroyed beyond repair. January 1945, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. Eisenhower sat in his office reading cables that outlined the complete disintegration of Allied command unity. American generals were threatening resignation. British political leadership was demanding Montgomery's vindication. The press on both sides of the Atlantic had turned coalition partnership into a spectator sport of national grievances. The Supreme Commander faced a decision that transcended military strategy: fire Montgomery and risk a political crisis with Britain, or retain him and watch American command lose all confidence in Allied leadership. For days, Eisenhower drafted and redrafted a cable to the combined chiefs of staff. The message was blunt: either Montgomery goes or I do. The Field Marshal's press conference had crossed a line from tactical disagreement into coalition-threatening arrogance. American forces would not serve under a commander who publicly diminished their sacrifices. Churchill received word of the crisis with alarm bordering on panic. Britain's Prime Minister understood what Montgomery apparently could not. The Empire's influence depended entirely on maintaining partnership with an America that now fielded the majority of Allied combat power, produced the majority of Allied war material, and suffered the majority of Allied casualties. Losing that partnership over Montgomery's ego would be a strategic catastrophe that no battlefield victory could offset. Churchill summoned Montgomery to London. The meeting was brief and brutal. The Prime Minister explained political reality with clarity that even Montgomery's self-regard couldn't deflect. Apologize to the Americans or be relieved of command. Britain could not afford a rupture with the United States. Montgomery's tactical abilities, however genuine, were not worth destroying the Anglo-American alliance. Montgomery returned to the continent and drafted an apology. The letter to Eisenhower, dated January 10th, represented the most humiliating moment of Montgomery's career. He expressed regret for any offense his remarks had caused. He praised American fighting qualities. He acknowledged the Supreme Commander's authority and pledged full cooperation. The words were correct. The tone was dutiful. But everyone who read the letter understood it had been extracted under duress, a political concession rather than genuine contrition. Eisenhower accepted the apology publicly. Privately, he began systematically reducing Montgomery's authority. In planning for the final drive into Germany, Eisenhower ensured Montgomery's 21st Army Group would conduct supporting operations while American armies, Bradley's 12th Army Group, and, later, Jacob Devers' 6th Army Group, executed the primary thrusts. British forces would advance into northern Germany, but the decisive battles would be American. Bradley and Patton required no instruction. They had already determined never to operate under Montgomery's authority again. Planning sessions became exercises in ensuring maximum distance between American and British command structures. When staff officers suggested operations that would require close coordination with Montgomery's forces, Bradley's response was instant and absolute. Find another approach. Patton was more colorful in his rejections, but the message was identical. Third Army would fight anywhere, against anyone, under any conditions, except under British command. The informal conspiracy extended throughout American headquarters. Montgomery's requests for resources were scrutinized with unprecedented skepticism. His tactical suggestions were acknowledged politely and ignored systematically. His presence at planning conferences was tolerated rather than welcomed. Montgomery seemed genuinely puzzled by the freeze. In his mind, the Ardennes controversy had been resolved. He had apologized, as requested. Surely professional relationships could return to normal. He fundamentally misunderstood what had happened. This was not a tactical disagreement that could be smoothed over with diplomatic language. It was the accumulated resentment of 3 years of condescension, credit-grabbing, and arrogant dismissal of American capabilities finally crystallizing into permanent opposition. American commanders had concluded that Montgomery was incapable of viewing them as equals. His apology changed nothing because his underlying assumptions, British superiority, American inexperience, his own indispensability, remained intact. The coalition survived because victory was imminent and professional discipline held. But the partnership had become purely transactional. Coordinated operations without trust, cooperation without respect, unity without genuine alliance. As Allied forces prepared for the final offensives into Germany, American planning reflected a single, overriding principle: win the war while minimizing any requirement to work with Montgomery. The Field Marshal had succeeded in making himself irrelevant to the commanders of the army that would finish the war he claimed to be winning. May 8, 1945. Europe. Victory in Europe arrived at not with unified celebration, but with separate ceremonies that reflected the fractured state of Allied command. Montgomery accepted the German surrender of forces in northern Germany on May 4th at his headquarters on Lüneburg Heath. The ceremony was characteristically theatrical, Montgomery presiding over German officers with the stern satisfaction of a headmaster disciplining wayward students. British newsreels captured the moment for an audience that had followed his journey from El Alamein to the Baltic. Eisenhower's formal ceremony followed days later, a carefully choreographed event designed to emphasize Allied unity. American, British, Soviet, and French commanders stood together for photographs that would illustrate coalition victory. The images concealed profound discord. In Britain, Montgomery's reputation reached apotheosis. He was elevated to Viscount Montgomery of Alamein, showered with honors, and celebrated as the general who had saved Britain in its darkest hour and led its forces to final victory. Churchill praised him. The king honored him. The British public adored him. He had earned their affection. El Alamein had been genuine deliverance. His careful husbanding of British lives, in a nation bled white by 2 world wars, had made him beloved by soldiers who knew he wouldn't waste them in futile offensives. His victories were real, his tactical skill undeniable. But in American headquarters, assessments took a harsher tone. Bradley's final evaluation was delivered privately to Eisenhower with characteristic understatement. Montgomery was the worst coalition commander I have ever known. The judgment wasn't about tactical competence. Bradley acknowledged Montgomery's abilities. It was about something more fundamental, the complete inability to function as a partner rather than a superior. Patton's diary entries were less diplomatic. He called Montgomery that cocky bastard who had nearly destroyed Allied unity through ego and arrogance. In Patton's view, Montgomery had treated American forces with contempt while benefiting from American blood, American steel, and American industrial might. Even Eisenhower, whose diplomatic skills had held the alliance together, privately admitted frustration that bordered on contempt. In conversations with American officers after the war, he acknowledged that managing Montgomery had consumed more energy than fighting the Germans, and had produced far less satisfying results. The mathematical reality of the war's final phase told its own story. By May 1945, American forces in Europe numbered over 3 million men. British forces comprised roughly 500,000. American casualties, killed, wounded, and missing, exceeded 586,000. British casualties, though proportionally higher given force sizes, totaled roughly 144,000. Americans had provided the overwhelming majority of the industrial output, manpower, and sacrifice that destroyed Nazi Germany. Yet Montgomery had spent 4 years acting as though British leadership remained preeminent and American contributions remained secondary. The disconnect had become unsustainable. In the victory celebrations that followed VE Day, American and British commanders appeared together for newsreels and photographs. They shook hands, exchanged pleasantries, and offered public tributes to coalition warfare. Behind the cameras, American generals ensured their paths diverged from Montgomery's as rapidly as professional courtesy permitted. Post-war planning reflected the breach. Montgomery was appointed to lead British occupation forces in Germany, a position of prestige and limited authority. American commanders ensured their zones of occupation minimized coordination requirements with British forces. When Montgomery published his wartime memoirs, American veterans read them with volcanic fury. The Field Marshal's account emphasized British achievements while relegating American contributions to supporting roles. Market Garden remained 90% successful. The Ardennes became a British rescue of American forces. Normandy emerged as Montgomery's master plan brilliantly executed. Bradley wrote his own memoir as rebuttal. Patton's posthumously published diary provided unfiltered counter-narrative. Eisenhower's careful diplomatic accounts nonetheless made clear where credit truly belonged. The historical debate would continue for decades, but among the Americans who fought under and alongside Montgomery, the verdict was unanimous and damning. He had been a brilliant general who won battles while losing allies, a tactician of genius, and a coalition partner of catastrophic inadequacy. In the end, that was his legacy. The man who helped win the war while nearly destroying the alliance that made victory possible. The paradox of command. Bernard Law Montgomery died in 1976, 31 years after the war he had helped win. His funeral drew dignitaries from across the Commonwealth. British veterans lined the streets, paying tribute to the general who had led them from the darkness of defeat to the light of victory. He was buried with full military honors, his reputation in Britain secure and unchallenged. In America, his passing merited respectful obituaries that acknowledged his tactical skill and carefully avoided discussing what American veterans actually thought of him. History has struggled to reconcile Montgomery's contradictions. He was genuinely brilliant, a master of the set-piece battle, a commander who understood logistics, preparation, and the careful application of overwhelming force. His soldiers loved him because he won while keeping them alive. His victories were earned through meticulous planning rather than reckless aggression. Yet he was also the general who nearly fractured the Western alliance through ego, condescension, and an inability to grasp the political dimensions of coalition warfare. The lesson of Montgomery is not that personal flaws doom military commanders. History is filled with difficult personalities who achieved greatness: Patton's profanity-laced fury, MacArthur's theatrical self-regard, Grant's struggles with alcohol. Armies tolerate difficult commanders if they deliver victories. Montgomery's failure was more subtle and more damaging. He could not adapt to the fundamental reality of coalition warfare. Victory requires managing relationships as much as managing operations. In North Africa, Sicily, Normandy, and the Ardennes, Montgomery fought as though British primacy remained unchallenged, even as American power eclipsed Britain's contribution in every measurable category. He treated American generals like promising students requiring guidance, even as they proved their competence in battles he never fought. He claimed credit for Allied victories as though American sacrifice was merely supporting effort for British achievement. His behavior reflected deeper currents. Britain's empire was contracting while America's power expanded. Montgomery's arrogance was partly personal ego, but it was also imperial reflex, the instinct of a ruling class that couldn't acknowledge its decline. American commanders understood this intuitively. Their frustration with Montgomery wasn't merely about personal slights. It was about watching a fading power demand deference it no longer deserved, credit it hadn't earned, and authority that coalition arithmetic no longer justified. The tragedy is that Montgomery's tactical brilliance became irrelevant. By 1945, his operational skill mattered less than his political toxicity, and American commanders structured operations specifically to avoid working with him. His advice was ignored, his requests minimized, his presence tolerated rather than valued. He had become a liability in a coalition that required trust. Modern military doctrine emphasizes coalition warfare as the norm rather than the exception. No nation fights alone. Victory requires coordinating not just tactics and logistics, but egos, national sensitivities, and competing political objectives. Montgomery's story serves as cautionary tale. Technical competence is necessary but insufficient. Battlefield brilliance means nothing if allies refuse to work with you. Winning battles while losing coalition partners is not victory. It's strategic failure wrapped in tactical success. The generals who understood this, Eisenhower's diplomatic patience, Bradley's quiet competence, even Patton's ability to subordinate his ego when operations required, shaped the war's outcome as much as any battlefield decision. Montgomery never learned the lesson. He remained convinced until his death that American complaints reflected their inexperience rather than his failures. He published memoirs that perpetuated the same narratives that had enraged American commanders during the war. He never grasped that coalition leadership requires humility as much as competence. The final assessment. In the end, Bernard Montgomery was exactly what American commanders called him, a brilliant general who excelled at winning battles but failed at winning allies. He helped defeat Nazi Germany, an achievement of genuine historical importance. But he did so while teaching future generations of military leaders a harsh lesson. In coalition warfare, the general who cannot manage relationships becomes a greater obstacle than the enemy he fights. Victory requires more than tactical genius. It requires the wisdom to recognize that wars are won not just on battlefields, but in the careful, patient work of maintaining alliances that battlefield brilliance alone can shatter. Montgomery mastered everything except that truth, and in coalition warfare, that single failure eclipsed all his victories.